So, the last couple of years have screwed with our typical sports schedule kind of a lot. Just last year, we had the 2020 Olympics happening in August of 2021, the 2020 European Championships happening a couple of months before that, we had the NBA Finals finishing in October, Masters happening a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, and just a slew of other major sporting events happening when they definitely weren't supposed to. I was as happy as anyone to have baseball come back, but opening day at the end of July? It's almost un American. But thankfully, things have largely gone back to normal schedule wise, and things like the Winter Olympics can happen as planned. There is one more thing, though, that's out of its normal place on the calendar. But the reason for that doesn't have anything to do with the global pandemic. If you're a casual soccer fan, or even a soccer denier, there's one event that's got to at least be vaguely on your radar. The FIFA World Cup comes around once every 4 years, and it's no exaggeration at all to say that this thing is the biggest sporting event on the planet. Now, in America, we tend to think that the Super Bowl is the top dog when it comes to things like that, and it's easy to see how we might get there. In 2018, more than 100 million people watched the Patriots play the Eagles, which is pretty impressive. But then there's the World Cup. Just a few months after that Patriots Eagles game, more than 1 billion people watched France play Croatia. You could literally take the entire continent of North America, plus France, Croatia, Germany, Spain, England, and all of Russia just for the heck of it, and you still wouldn't have enough people to match up with everyone watching that game. So yeah, it's a big freaking deal. Even if you are completely soccer illiterate, you know that the World Cup is a thing, and probably that it happens every 4 years. But let me tell you something, friends. Even if it is technically happening on schedule, this World Cup is not going to be like those other ones. Sure, it may have been held in the summer for the past 90 years, regardless of whatever geopolitical conflict may have been going on at the time besides a literal world war, but this year is gonna be special. Because this year, for the first time since 1930, the first time since at least one of the participating countries has literally ceased to exist, the World Cup is happening in the winter. Why is it happening in the winter, I hear you ask? Because FIFA, the governing body that puts on the World Cup, awarded the 2022 World Cup to Qatar. And I don't know how much you know about Qatar, but as far as features go, apart from having a lovely capital city situated right in the Persian Gulf, most of the country is in the middle of the frickin' desert. And just to address this up front, I'm going to pronounce it Qatar. I'm sorry if that upsets you. I know it's not right, but I'm white and American, and my mouth just legitimately doesn't make the right sounds. Anyway, it turns out it gets pretty hot in Qatar, like life-threateningly hot, which makes playing a major soccer tournament there in the summer pretty untenable. So FIFA, in their infinite wisdom, moved the entire tournament, which I feel like I should remind you is the biggest event in the world, to the winter, which, not for nothing, is right in the middle of the club season for a lot of the players that are going to participate. So why, knowing that they would have to move the tournament and functionally stop the entire club football calendar in the process, would FIFA award the World Cup to Qatar in the first place? The answer to that question, of course, is corruption. But it also brings us to a more overarchingly bad thought, which is thinking about this from the Qatari perspective. Why would Qatar, a country without a major soccer league and probably not enough existing infrastructure to host the tournament, want to host the World Cup? Bidding for and eventually hosting a World Cup is incredibly expensive, both in terms of money and resources. So why would a country with fewer people in it than the city of Los Angeles be at the front of the line? It might be because the people in charge of Qatar and its football federation want to take the next step and show off their country's progress to the world. In the past few years, they've pulled in stars like James Rodriguez, Toby Alderweireld, Santi Cazorla, and most notably, former Barcelona star Xavi Hernandez to play in their domestic league. It would really be a win for the entire Arabian Peninsula, whose countries have continued to see their influence in soccer grow over the past couple of decades, to bring the World Cup to Qatar. From that perspective, and the fact that money isn't really an object for an oil-rich country like Qatar, bidding for the World Cup makes total sense. But there is also a second potential explanation, and I'll go ahead and say up front that it's a lot less flattering. Qatar gained its independence from Britain in 1971, and it's pretty much been making moves ever since. And while that's helped the country's influence grow tremendously, it's also invited a lot more attention from the international community. And no matter how much oil money you have, if you're a country that's functionally an absolute monarchy with a questionable record on human rights, that's going to bring about some scrutiny. So if you're Qatar and you're trying to keep your diplomatic reputation intact while also continuing to do things the way you've always done them, what's one thing you can try? Hosting a major international sporting event. The idea is known as sportswashing, which Amnesty International defines as the use of sports by oppressive governments to legitimize their regimes and distract from their human rights abuses. Karim Zidane wrote a really good piece for The Guardian about it a few weeks ago, which you should totally go read if you want to hear from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And Qatar are far from the first country to run this playbook. In that same article, Zidane mentions how Hitler basically tried the same thing in the 1936 Olympics. Then there was the 1934 World Cup in Mussolini's Italy, the 1964 European Championships in Franco's Spain, the 1980 Olympics in the Soviet Union. You get the idea. For nearly 100 years, so many countries have done this exact same thing, for seemingly the exact same reason. And now, in 2022, we have Qatar hosting the World Cup and Xi Jinping's China hosting the Winter Olympics. All of this leads to the question that we always try to ask on this channel, which is, why? Why do countries keep doing this? What about this strategy is so appealing that rulers all over the world from as different a backgrounds as you can possibly imagine would all try and get in on the action? To answer this, we're going to have to go back to our old friends, the behaviorists. In the last video, we talked a little bit about how psychologists like B.F. Skinner studied a phenomenon known as operant conditioning. The basic idea there is that behaviors can be encouraged or discouraged through punishments and rewards. Skinner and his team would do things like putting a lever in front of a rat, and if the rat did what they wanted it to, like pull the lever a certain number of times, the rat would get a snack. And if it didn't, it would get an electric shock, because it turns out these experiments were all pretty inhumane. But that's basically how operant conditioning works, and whether people like it or not, and plenty of people don't, it's still in use in a lot of behavioral therapy today. In the case of sports washing, though, we're actually dealing with the less involved cousin of that idea, which is known as classical conditioning. Instead of focusing on punishments and rewards, the theory behind classical conditioning holds that behavior can be subconsciously influenced by associations, which are usually conditioned over time. The most famous example of this is Pavlov's dogs, where a Russian scientist called Ivan Pavlov, who, incidentally, was not a psychologist, found that the dogs he was studying would salivate when they heard the sound of a bell. The idea there is that because the bell was rung whenever the dogs were being fed, over time, the animals had learned to sort of subconsciously cut out the middleman. After a while, the dogs would start to salivate at the sound of the bell, or the sound of the scientist's footsteps, or pretty much anything they connected to getting fed, whether there was actually food around or not. You may have noticed this kind of thing around your house, too. Like how your dog might freak out if you put on tennis shoes because it thinks you're going on a walk. Because dogs are smart, it's learned to make the association between the act of you putting on shoes and going out to do its literal favorite thing in the world. This is how a lot of advertising theory works, too. Nike wasn't nearly the juggernaut they are today before they signed Michael Jordan, and marketed him to the point that he and the brand became almost inseparable. You may never use Farmers Insurance or Aflac, but you know that jingle, and you recognize that duck. What is Jake from State Farm wearing? Exactly. You get my point. Subconsciously, we have associated those brands with those people and those ideas, which we like. And in theory, that makes us more likely to buy whatever it is they're selling us. And that's what a country like Qatar is counting on, too. I may not like Qatar or even know that much about them, but I do like Kylian Mbappe, and so do a whole lot of other people. And come November, that's where he's going to be. There will be hundreds of millions of people watching the World Cup like there always are. And the Qataris know that this is going to be the first introduction to their country for a lot of people. And if they can help it, they want that association to be a positive one. And this isn't their first stab at this either. To get a little more literal with our advertising example, Qatar Airways started sponsoring Barcelona back in 2013. They were arguably still the best team in the world at the time, and now they had Qatar's state-owned airlines logo plastered across the front of their shirts. Incidentally, Barcelona didn't have a shirt sponsor at all for the majority of their history. Then they signed a deal with UNICEF in 2006, and then logically, the next step was signing a deal with the Qataris. Literally can't think of a more cognitively dissonant series of decisions, but there you are. The Qatari Sports Investment Fund also bought PSG in 2011, presumably because they'd seen the success that their neighbors to the south in Abu Dhabi had had with Manchester City. Now, officially, none of these teams have anything to do with the countries themselves, but yeah, the UAE pretty much owns Man City, the Qataris own PSG, and as of a few months ago, the government of Saudi Arabia functionally owns Newcastle. State ownership of a club is kind of a different conversation, but it's definitely related, because if you're Saudi Arabia, you'd definitely rather have people associate you with your soccer team than with a journalist that you may or may not have had murdered. Now, is this strategy completely successful? That's debatable, but we'll address that more in part 2. It's not absolute, obviously. We didn't all just collectively forget about the Nazis because they hosted the Olympics that one time. But modern governments know that, and they're still doing it. So there has to be some appeal there, right? Hosting the World Cup or the Olympics may not be enough to make everyone forget that you're a literal despot, but it is a pretty useful propaganda tool for the people within your country, and if you can distract people outside of it enough to make them forget about you, I don't know, annexing Crimea for a little while, that can't hurt either. You've got a huge platform for a few weeks to showcase the more palatable parts of your country, with basically no one to question anything else. It's not like NBC or Fox are going to give you much pushback. They've both paid billions of dollars for the rights to broadcast these events, and aren't going to do much, if anything, to jeopardize that investment, especially when they know they're going to have a short leash to begin with. Uyghurs? What Uyghurs? Here's some dudes doing the luge. A few thousand migrant workers may have died to bring you this World Cup match, but that's not going to stop us from airing it, now is it? We'll come back to how effective sports washing is in the long term later, but for now, I'll leave you with this. We all know that there are some uncomfortable truths that underline a lot of the sports that we care so much about. Even in these United States, there are plenty of people who buy teams to cover up for being less than stellar human beings. But Brazil spent billions of dollars of public money and nearly tanked their entire economy to host the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. People died because those events went forward, despite the country's obvious lack of readiness for them. But when I think about the 2014 World Cup, I remember Mario Götze scoring in the final against Messi. I remember Simone Biles winning the all-around 2 years later at the Olympics. Maybe it's just because I'm American, but the only scandalous thing that I remember happening in Brazil itself was Ryan Lochte lying to the cops. My mental association is with the event itself, much more than where it took place. If anything, the host country exists in my memory as a series of wide shots of important landmarks and a few throwaway lines from commentators. That's what sports washing can do if you're not thinking about it. It can take a massive global event that really shouldn't be divorced from its current context and basically turn it into a giant commercial. A commercial that hundreds of millions of people are going to watch, and that broadcasters have paid billions of dollars to broadcast. That's what these things can become if we're not careful, which we very much should be. We're going to get plenty of practice soon, though. China and Qatar will have the entire world's attention over the coming weeks and months. And if everything goes according to their plan, that's all they'll be paying attention to. Hello to everybody out there who made it this far. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you did get all the way to the end, you might as well take the time to leave us a like and subscribe for more content. Part 2 of this video will be the next one that I put out because I just couldn't get enough talking about dictators. I promise they won't always be this doom and gloomy though, because if they were, I'm pretty sure I'd get depressed pretty quickly. Anyway, we're just a few days away from the Winter Olympics opening, so if you've got thoughts about those games or even the circumstances they're taking place in, feel free to leave them below in the comments, as well as any other ideas you might have for future videos. Thank you so much again for watching the video, and I will see all of you next time for part 2.